Leadville, Colorado, October 1882. The air at 10,000 feet was already thin and sharp, a blade whetted by the coming winter. Down in the gulches, the aspen had surrendered their gold, leaving skeletal white branches against the dark shoulders of the mountains. For the miners and their families, it was the season of preparation, a frantic race of banking earth against cabin walls, chinking logs with mud and moss, and stockpiling cords of pine and spruce. But Carenza Trevithick was preparing differently. She was gathering trash. Every day after her husband Tamsin left for his shift at the Matchless Mine, she would take a burlap sack to the refuse pile behind the superintendent's office. She ignored the broken timber and shattered rock, focusing instead on the growing mountain of discarded tin cans, containers that had once held beans, salted fish, or peaches shipped over the high passes. She moved with a quiet purpose that baffled the other wives and drew scorn from the men. "Look at the Cornish woman," said Elias Vance, a timberman leaning on his axe handle, "building herself a palace of rubbish." Caleb Fry, a blaster with dust in the lines of his face, shook his head. "She's gone mountain mad. That thin air gets to some folks." Odell Sharp, the mine superintendent, watched her from his office window. He was a man who valued order and proven methods, a man responsible for the lives of 200 workers. He saw not eccentricity, but a dangerous foolishness. He walked out, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Mrs. Trevithick," he began, his voice firm but not unkind. "Whatever you are planning, I cannot have you encouraging this. My men need their wives focused on practical matters. Winter is not a time for projects." Carenza looked up, shielding her eyes against the hard, high-altitude sun. She held a dented can in her gloved hand. She simply nodded and said, "It is a practical matter, Mr. Sharp." She dropped the can into her sack and turned back to the pile. Sharp watched her for a moment longer, a portrait of quiet, inexplicable obsession. The word went through the camp before the evening shift change. The Trevithick woman wasn't just odd. She was crazy. What did this Cornish mine shaft liner, a woman who had never built a house in her life, understand about the physics of heat that the most experienced carpenters and mine superintendents in Leadville had missed? This story is about more than just a strange cabin. It's about a forgotten principle of thermodynamics, one that could mean the difference between life and death on the high frontier. I promise that by the end of this account, you will understand how a wall can act like a mirror and why the most valuable heat is the heat you already have. Stick with me, and if you find this kind of practical history compelling, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories of forgotten ingenuity. Let me know in the comments, what's the cleverest low-tech solution you've ever seen for a serious problem? Carenza Trevithick was not a frontierswoman. She was not a farmer or a carpenter. Before Colorado, her world had been the deep, dark, and damp of the tin mines of Cornwall, England. She was a liner of shafts, a woman whose hands knew the cold, weeping feel of granite, the precise fit of shoring timbers, and the curve of a steam engine's iron boiler. Her husband, Tamsin, was a hard rock man, a cousin Jack lured across the ocean by the promise of silver wages that dwarfed anything he could earn at home. They arrived in Leadville in the late summer of 1881, with their son, Jago, 7, and daughter Morwenna, 5 and a deep, abiding knowledge of rock, but almost no understanding of wood or wind. Their first cabin was a standard affair, a single room of green-milled pine planks, 12 feet by 16, with a cast-iron stove in the center. It was a kit, assembled quickly and chinked with whatever they could find. It felt solid enough in the warm September sun. Then came their first Leadville winter. It was a winter of education, delivered with brutal efficiency. The problem began with the wind. At 10,152 feet, the wind was not a simple breeze. It was a physical force, a relentless pressure seeking any flaw. It found dozens in their cabin. The green lumber of the walls shrank as it dried in the arid air, opening up hair-thin gaps between the planks. The wind exploited everyone, slicing through the chinking and filling the room with drafts that felt like daggers of ice. The single-pane glass window frosted over on the inside and never cleared until May. Their stove, a magnificent cast-iron beast, consumed wood at an astonishing rate. They could get it roaring hot, the metal glowing a faint cherry red, but the heat seemed to vanish. It rose to the uninsulated roof and bled out into the sky. The walls remained frigid to the touch. Tamsin and Carenza sat huddled by the fire, their fronts roasting while their backs felt the chill. At night, they would stuff the stove with pine and bank the coals, but by midnight the fire would be a ghost of itself. Frost would begin to creep across the interior walls, a beautiful, deadly filigree of ice crystals sparkling in the moonlight. The water in the bucket by the door would be a solid block by morning. Jago and Morwenna slept in their coats and hats, buried under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the dark air. Carenza knew heat. In the deep shafts of Cornwall, a single candle or oil lamp was a precious source of warmth and light. The miners knew how to line small workspaces with sheets of tin to reflect the lamp's feeble light and, more importantly, its heat, back onto their hands and faces. It was a simple trick that doubled the functional output of a tiny flame. As she shivered through that first Colorado winter, staring at the roaring stove that failed to heat their small box of a room, she thought of those subterranean spaces. The problem wasn't the stove. The stove was making plenty of heat. The problem was the room. It was a sieve, a black hole for warmth. She vowed that if they survived until spring, they would not endure a second winter like the first. The failure of the Trevithick's cabin was the failure of every cabin in Leadville. The settlers had brought with them the building techniques of the lower, wetter, less windy worlds they came from. Here, those techniques were tragically insufficient. The core of the problem, the invisible thief that stole the warmth from every stove, was thermal radiation. Everything in the universe that has a temperature above absolute zero radiates energy. A fire, a stove, a human body, they all emit invisible waves of infrared light. This is radiant heat. When these waves strike an object, they transfer their energy to it, warming it up. In a standard frontier cabin, the hot stove radiated energy in all directions. The air was heated by convection, which was helpful, but a huge portion of the energy traveled as infrared waves directly to the walls, floor, and ceiling. The pine planks of the walls were, from a physics perspective, disastrously inefficient. Wood is a relatively poor insulator against conducted heat, but it is an excellent absorber and emitter of radiant heat. It has a high emissivity. This meant the inner surfaces of the walls eagerly soaked up the infrared energy from the stove and the family's bodies. The wood warmed up and then immediately began radiating that same energy from its outer surface into the brutally cold Colorado night. The cabin wall was acting as a perfect transfer agent, diligently passing the precious, hard-won heat from inside to outside. Burning more wood only accelerated the process. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a gaping hole in the bottom by pouring water in faster. The settlers understood drafts. They understood the cold of a floor. They could feel that. What they couldn't see or feel was the silent, steady, relentless flow of radiant energy leaving their bodies and their fires and pouring straight through the wooden walls as if they were hardly there. They were fighting a battle against conduction and convection with chinking and bigger fires, all while losing a war against radiation they didn't even know they were fighting. Carenza Trevithick, remembering the tin reflectors deep underground, was about to fight that war. Her plan, when she explained it to Tamsin, was met with weary trust. He had seen his wife's quiet competence solve problems of water and rock in the mines back home. This was just a different kind of rock, a different kind of problem. The work began in August. First, they built a second interior wall. Using the thinnest, cheapest planks they could buy, they framed a new wall inside the existing one, leaving a precise 3-inch gap between the old exterior wall and the new interior one. This alone drew puzzled looks from their neighbors. "Building a house inside your house?" Silas Croft, another miner, called out. "Planning on renting out the space between?" Carenza ignored him. The real work was in the preparation of the cans. She and the children spent weeks on the cabin's floor with shears and a small hammer. They cut the tops and bottoms from the hundreds of cans they had collected. Then they sliced the resulting cylinders down the seam and hammered them flat on a piece of scrap iron Tamsin had brought from the mine. The result was a stack of rough rectangular sheets of tin, some still bearing the faded labels of their former contents. This was the part that truly cemented Carenza's reputation as the camp eccentric. While other families were laying in stores, she was manufacturing scrap metal. But she had a clear vision. Starting on the north wall, there's the one that bore the brunt of the winter wind, she began nailing the flattened tin sheets to the inside face of the outer wall. She overlapped each piece slightly, like shingles, until the entire surface of the original wall was covered in a continuous, gleaming, metallic skin. It was painstaking work. The tin was hard to nail, and its sharp edges were unforgiving. But slowly, the dark pine of the cabin's interior vanished behind a patchwork of silver. Odell Sharp made a second, more formal visit. He stepped inside, his eyes taking in the bizarre spectacle. "Mrs. Trevithick," he said, his voice tight with authority, "I have to insist you stop this. Tin is not a building material. When the moisture from your breath and your cooking hits that cold metal, it will sweat. The water will get into your walls and rot this cabin from the inside out. Worse, the tin itself will rust. Rust in an enclosed space like that. It can poison the air. I have families in this camp, and I will not have one of them spreading sickness because of a strange experiment." He was not being malicious. His concerns were grounded in the common knowledge of the time. He believed he was protecting her and the community from her own ignorance. Carenza wiped a smudge of grime from her cheek with the back of her hand. She looked at the wall, then at him. "It will not be cold," she said. It was all the argument she offered. Sharp's face hardened. "I'm warning the other families to keep their distance," he said, and left. After he was gone, Tamsin looked at his wife. "He is superintendent, Carenza." "He is a good man," she replied, picking up her hammer, "but he does not understand mirrors." And she went back to her work. They finished the tin lining, then nailed up the new interior planks, sealing the metallic shield into the 3-inch cavity. To the naked eye, their cabin now simply looked like it had slightly thicker walls, but hidden within was a revolution. To understand what Carenza had built, you have to understand the invisible world of thermal radiation. Think of the heat from a campfire on a cold night. You can feel it on your face even when the air between you and the fire is freezing. That is radiation. It's not moving via the air. It's traveling as electromagnetic waves, just like light, but at a wavelength your eyes can't see. Every object in that cabin, the stove, the people, the lamp, the dog sleeping on the floor, was a small radiator, broadcasting this infrared energy. In a normal cabin, the wooden walls have a high emissivity, around 0.90. This means they absorb 90% of the radiant energy that strikes them, and in turn, are very effective at radiating that energy away from their outer surface. It's a one-way street for heat, out. Polished metal, however, behaves in the exact opposite way. It has a very low emissivity, often as low as 0.05. This means two things. First, it's a poor radiator. It doesn't give off its own heat very well. Second, and far more importantly, it is an excellent reflector of thermal radiation. That patchwork of flattened tin cans Carenza had so painstakingly assembled acted as a mirror, but a mirror for heat instead of light. When the radiant energy from the stove and the family traveled across the room and hit the new, thin inner wall, it passed through the wood. But when it reached the hidden tin barrier, it didn't stop. It bounced. Roughly 90% of that outgoing infrared energy was reflected straight back through the inner wall and into the room. The heat that would have been absorbed by the outer wall and lost to the Colorado winter was instead captured, turned around, and sent back to keep the occupants warm. Carenza had effectively lined her living space with an invisible blanket of its own recycled heat. Furthermore, the 3-inch air gap she had created was critical. This pocket of dead air was a powerful insulator against the other two forms of heat transfer. Heat struggles to move through still air via conduction, and because the air was trapped in a narrow space between two walls, it couldn't circulate effectively, which stopped heat loss from convection. Sharp's fear of condensation was unfounded for a simple reason he couldn't have anticipated, because the tin was reflecting heat back into the cavity. The surface of the tin itself never got cold enough for moisture to condense on it. It was protected by the very energy it was designed to save. Carenza Trevithick hadn't just built thicker walls. She had installed a one-way valve for thermal energy. Heat could get in, but it could not easily get out. That November, winter came to Leadville not as a gentle transition, but as an invasion. A mass of Arctic air descended from the north and settled over the high Rockies, refusing to move. The temperature plummeted and stayed there. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer outside the assay office never rose above -18 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, it dropped to 30, then 40 below zero. The wind was a constant, scouring force that drove snow into drifts as high as the cabin roofs. For the camp, it was a siege. The sound of axes splitting frozen wood was constant. Men trudged through the deep snow, bowed under the weight of logs, their beards frozen solid. Inside the standard cabins, life ground to a miserable halt. Families lived in a small, huddled circle around their stoves, which were now fed constantly, day and night. The outer edges of the rooms were effectively uninhabitable, with walls so cold they felt sticky to the touch. Water barrels froze solid even when placed a few feet from the fire. Ink turned to slush in its wells. Sickness followed, with a chorus of coughs echoing through the thin walls of the settlement. Odell Sharp organized extra shifts for woodcutting, his face a grim mask of worry. In the Trevithick cabin, something remarkable was happening. It was warm. It wasn't the oppressive dry blast of an overdriven stove. It was a gentle, pervasive, even warmth that reached every corner of the small room. Tamsin had laid in what he thought was a barely adequate supply of wood. They were burning less than half of it. A small, steady fire in the stove was enough to keep the entire space at a comfortable 65 degrees. The contrast between their reality and the camp's was stark and immediate. The proof was in the small details of domestic life, the things made possible by the defeat of the cold. Carenza could prove bread dough on the table in the corner furthest from the stove. The yeast, which required a stable, gentle warmth, rose beautifully. Morwenna sat on the floor, away from the fire, mending one of her father's socks, her fingers nimble and bare. The water bucket had a thin skim of ice only on the coldest morning, and it was gone within an hour of the fire being tended. The single window, which had been a sheet of opaque ice all the previous winter, now had only a delicate fringe of frost at its edges. Through the clear center, they could watch the snow swirl past. They lived in their home, not just in a shrinking circle around their stove. They had created a tiny island of temperate climate in the midst of an Arctic maelstrom. The rumors began to circulate with the men who delivered wood. They would enter the Trevithick cabin to make their delivery and be struck by the wall of warmth. They would leave, shaking their heads, and tell the others. Some said she was a witch. Others said she had a secret, more efficient stove shipped from back east. No one believed the truth, because the truth that the difference was a lining of garbage was too absurd. Odell Sharp heard the stories. He dismissed them as exaggeration, but the seed of curiosity was planted. His primary concern, however, remained the danger he had warned Carenza about: rot and rust. After 3 weeks of extreme cold, he reasoned, any condensation problem would be at its worst. He decided it was his duty to inspect the property for the family's own safety. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and walked through the howling wind to their cabin. He knocked, his glove making a dull thud. Tamsin opened the door, and a cloud of warm air, visible as fog in the bitter cold, billowed out. Sharp stepped inside, bracing himself for the damp, metallic chill he expected. He felt nothing of the sort. The air was dry. It was not just warm. It was comfortably, evenly warm. He stood there for a moment, letting the sensation wash over him. It was so profoundly different from the biting cold of his own well-built superintendent's house that it felt like a physical shock. Without thinking, he unwrapped his scarf. Then he unbuttoned his thick wool coat. Finally, he shrugged it off entirely, holding it in his arm, an act of pure instinct. In any other cabin in Leadville, on this day, such an act would be unthinkable. Carenza was sitting at the table, watching him. She said nothing. "How?" Sharp finally asked, his voice quiet with awe. "Your stove is no different than mine?" "The walls," Carenza said simply. "They do not lose the heat." Sharp, the practical man of science and engineering, needed proof his senses could quantify. He walked to the interior wall. He expected it to be cold, perhaps even damp. He placed the back of his bare hand against the smooth pine planks. It was warm, not hot, but distinctly, undeniably warm, like a stone that had been lying in the sun. He couldn't understand it. The heat source was 10 feet away. Then he turned to the unlined partition wall that separated the main room from a small sleeping alcove. It was the same wood, the same distance from the stove. He placed the back of his hand against it. The cold was shocking, a deep, penetrating chill that felt like touching a block of ice. He pulled his hand back as if burned. There it was, the irrefutable sensory proof. One wall, backed by a hidden layer of tin cans, held the room's warmth. The other, built to the accepted standard of the day, was a thermal leak, bleeding heat into the frigid air. The gap between expectation and reality, between what he knew and what he felt, was the entire story. He looked from his hand to Carenza's face. The mockery he had felt was gone, replaced by a profound and unsettling respect. "Show me," he said. "Show me everything." He wasn't asking about the rust anymore. He was asking how much tin it would take to line his own house. "You didn't build a warmer cabin," he thought, his mind struggling for the right words. "You built a room that can't forget the fire." Odell Sharp was a convert, and his conversion was absolute. As a superintendent, his word carried the weight of authority. The next morning, a notice, handwritten by Sharp himself, was pinned to the miner's bulletin board at the entrance to the matchless mine. It was not a suggestion. It was a directive disguised as a technical report. It began regarding the efficient consumption of fuel for domestic heating. In precise, clear language, it detailed the construction of what he termed the Trevithick thermal wall. He described the 3-inch cavity, the application of a metallic reflective surface, specifying flattened tin provisions cans, and the final interior sheathing. He included a rudimentary diagram. Most importantly, he included the numbers. The Trevithick cabin maintains an interior temperature of 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit during peak winter conditions on an estimated 1/3 the cordwood of a standard build cabin of identical dimension. The effect was immediate. Mockery turned to intense curiosity. Tamsin and Carenza were no longer the camp eccentrics. They were the resident experts in a new and vital science. Miners, men who trusted numbers and results over rumor, began collecting cans with a fervor. Tamsin, with Carenza's guidance, spent his off-shift hours supervising the retrofitting of his neighbors' cabins. By the time the Great Freeze broke in January, a half-dozen cabins in their section of the camp had been lined. The results were identical. Fuel consumption plummeted. Comfort soared. The idea, now proven and endorsed, has spread with the natural efficiency of the frontier. Miners writing to family and colleagues in other camps included descriptions of the Trevithick wall. The bulletin notice was copied by hand and carried by mule train over the passes. By the spring of 1883, variations of the tin can radiant barrier were being built in the booming mining camps of Cripple Creek, Telluride, and Silverton. It was a piece of practical, life-altering knowledge, given freely and adopted rapidly because its benefits were not theoretical. They were measured in cords of wood saved and children who no longer slept in their coats. What Carenza Trevithick accomplished in her small, cold cabin was more than just a clever trick. She had, without formal training, stumbled upon a fundamental principle of modern building science, a principle that would not be widely understood or commercialized for nearly a century. The gleaming hidden wall of tin cans was a crude but highly effective radiant barrier. Today, this technology is ubiquitous. The shiny foil layer you see on modern home insulation, the thin metallic film inside a thermos, and the low emissivity or low-E coatings on high-performance windows all operate on the exact same principle. They are all heat mirrors. Even the emergency space blankets found in survival kits are a direct descendant of this idea. A thin sheet of mylar that reflects a person's own body heat back onto them, preventing hypothermia. Carenza's innovation was not in discovering a new law of physics, but in applying an old one learned in the darkness of a Cornish mine to solve a deadly problem on a windswept Colorado mountainside. She was decades ahead of her time. There is a philosophy embedded in the walls of that Leadville cabin, a quiet wisdom that speaks to the core of all true ingenuity. The frontier, in its mythology, celebrates production, brute force, and tireless effort. Chopping more wood, building a bigger fire, wrestling a living from a harsh landscape. The story is always about adding more energy to the system. Carenza Trevithick's solution was different. It wasn't about making more heat. It was about honoring the heat you already had. Her simple wall of cans posed a revolutionary question. What if the most valuable resource isn't the fuel you burn, but the warmth you manage to keep? It suggests that true mastery over an environment comes not from overwhelming it, but from understanding its invisible currents and turning them to your advantage. The heat that is already in the room is heat you don't have to make. It is a lesson in conservation over consumption, in intelligence over raw effort. It is the simple, profound truth that sometimes the most powerful act is not to build a better fire, but to build a better mirror. Thank you for joining us for this exploration of frontier ingenuity. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the history of practical problem solving. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What modern technologies can you think of that rely on the same principle of radiant heat reflection? Your engagement helps us bring more of these incredible stories to light. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative clarity, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and physics. Any application of these or similar building techniques today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.